few years it has been. But what the crisis of this year showed, the migration crisis of India, which was unprecedented in terms of the volume, for the simple reason that the Indian Railways has probably never been shut down in its 150-year history. And so shutting down the Indian Railways obviously scatters, or it builds a lot of insecurity and vulnerability in large sections of the population. And so a lot of people who never really paid attention to migration have suddenly woken up. And in a way, like we say in India, we probably require a crisis to wake us up. This is probably a good crisis on the migration sector, because there were a lot of things which needed to be really highlighted in the migration sector. So what I have about, I'll talk for maybe 30, 40 minutes and be happy to take questions at the end of it. But what I'm going to talk about is to give you a brief overview to help you understand the complexity about the history and the geography of migration. And obviously with that comes the economics. That is, why do people move? What is the payoff from migration? And I'm going to end the talk with this migration crisis as to why did the crisis happen? How could it have been averted? And what should we learn from it so that going forward, we don't make the same mistakes again. All right. So let me now. Yeah, so you can see this, right? Yeah. All right. So, let me start this story today with a image from the late 19th century. And you'll see the title, it's from the Illustrated London News, and it says modes of traveling in India. And you'll see people being carried on the palki, people on the elephant, people crawling, a variety of things. And at the last panel is of course the railways, right? And so in a way, what we say is, the railways of course did not introduce mobility to Indians. If you read the first chapter of my book, I argue that Indians have always been on the move. But what the railways do for sure is to increase the speed of mobility within the subcontinent. And I'm purposely starting this presentation of the railways because I'm going to end it with the migration crisis when the railways were shut down. Right? And so the railways is much more than just a means of transport. It is literally the lifeline of our country. Now, the British, of course, started the railways for a variety of purposes, but it's really in the late 19th century where this, for thousands of years, the maximum speed of movement within the subcontinent was the speed of the horse. And then suddenly you have that speed shattered by the railways. And so suddenly people can start making long distance journeys and, start moving around very freely. Of course, it also increases recruitment for overseas work. People also went by ships, but to go reach the ports, of course, people started using the railways. And so you have this real mass migration wave pick up in the late 19th century. So we're talking more than 100 years back in the late 19th century, in decades like the 1880s, 1890s, and so on. And this led to a particular migration wave, what I argue in my book as something called as the Great Indian Migration Wave. And I will show you a map of India in a while to explain where people are migrating in India from. But this is just to give some a picture to those people. This is from one of our field studies in the Ratnagiri district, which is, of course, I'm sure many of you have traced your ancestry to the Konkan region. I have, I think, 1/4 ancestry, if I'm not mistaken, to the Konkan region. But Konkan region in Maharashtra at least is very famous, and of course it's very famous for mangoes, the Alfonso mango. But in migration studies, it's also famous for these really altered sex ratios, or what we like to call as man and goes. Right? So the men are continuously migrating. Now this is a particular family from the Konkan region, and this is the photo taken in Bombay in Chembur. But this is probably the only time the entire family was there. Otherwise, the gentleman that you see, he came to Bombay, he worked all his life, and he did not settle down in Bombay. And that's the key. This is a time when Bombay was called Bombay, not Mumbai. So 1960s or so. This is the photo taken from around then. And this gentleman belongs to a family where generations of people, the men, have moved out of Konkan, gone to Bombay for work, and come back. They have not settled down in Bombay. So this is what we call a circular migration, people not settling down when they go there. Note that the women, while they are there in this photograph, were mostly in the Konkan. They never went to Bombay apart from vacations or holidays like this. And the children that you see in this map, or the sons in particular, eventually also started going to Bombay and So this became a cycle of migration where the men go, come back, and their sons go, and in the meantime, the daughters are looking after the family and land back. Right. So this is a particular pattern of migration that we see in the Konkan. And it's very stark. All of you, I'm sure, are aware of sex ratios. This is a time series of sex ratios from 1901 to now, and you'll see how India is, there at 950 to 1,000. That's the sex ratios in India, right? About 900 up to 950 females to 1,000 males. But what I've argued in my research is that, contrary to Amartya Sen's, famous missing women, India also has districts with missing men. And Ratnagiri, Udupi, certain districts of India have had remarkably skewed sex ratios for more than 100 years. And you'll see how stark this chart is, where we are saying that the sex ratio literally never fell below 1,100 females to 1,000 males. And this is not a 1 decade or 2 decade phenomenon. This is a 100-year-old phenomenon. In fact, it's from the first census. If I stretch it back to about the 1870s, it really starts off in the late 19th century. That's why I mentioned the significance of that period. Now, it is not just Ratnagiri or Udupi. Of course, Udupi, you should know, all the famous Udupi restaurants that you see in Pune or Bombay or around India is actually very closely linked with this line. That is, generations of these guys have come, worked in the restaurants, but interestingly never settled. They've made money and gone back. Right? So this is a particular kind of migration. So this is the map. This is the migration map of India. It's taken from the data of 2007-8 National Sample Survey. And I argue of a particular pattern, what I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave. Right? So what are the particular aspects of this migration wave? Well, it's remittance based, right? And that should interest a student of economics, because this is actual money being sent from the destination to the source. So the migrant psychology is to save as much money possible to send back money home. It is semi-permanent, which means it is not a permanent release of surplus labor, and it is male-dominated. Again, it leads to what I call as remittance urbanism, which means the person's life in the city is geared towards saving as much and enjoying retirement back home in the native. Now, because I suspect, I think all of you, a lot of you are economic students, let me explain the significance of this in our classic economic theory sort of term. I think a lot of you would have heard at some point of someone called as Arthur Lewis, and something called as the Lewisian model of development, Lewisian two-sector model, and so on. And what that model suggests is, transfer of surplus labor from regions with surplus labor to regions with deficient labor. So classically, in any process of economic development, you have this migration process, which kind of moves people away from farms into cities. But what we've seen in India is a twist to the Lewisian pattern. We see that it's not a permanent release of, India is not conforming to the Lewisian pattern, which explains the Chinese story so well, the Chinese structural transformation story of the last 30 years, where both men and women move to cities on a more permanent basis. Whereas in India, because it's only the men who are moving, it is not permanent because they are also going back. So there is really no permanent release from rural areas in India. And that's a huge part of the story, because what I estimate is that the bulk of work-related migration in India is actually circular in nature. Okay. Now, let me explain this map in a bit, and then I'll take you through why people migrate, different types of migrations, and so on. So what this map shows you is, of course, work-related migration. Okay, and this is from the NSS 2007-8. You might argue that this is 13 years old. Haven't things changed since? Things changed since then? Well, maybe there are a few corridors, new corridors which have developed. But what I've shown in my book, my PhD dissertation, etc., is that this map is actually pretty similar to what you would see even 100 years back, right? Because of this phenomenon of migration persistence. So the first region that you should know is this region called the west coast of India, and that's pretty close to Pune, but you're in a way on the sort of wrong side of the migration map, or maybe the right side of the migration map, in the sense that Pune belongs to districts where few people migrate away from, right? So that's Pune's out here, okay, out here. Right? But as you go on the one side of the Western Ghats, right, all the way from Ratnagiri, which is the Konkan region, even Goa, by the way, there are taluks in Goa with mass out migration. And then you go down south, Udupi, this is what we saw earlier. And then almost all of Kerala, as you know, is huge out migration to the Gulf. I don't make a distinction between internal and international out-migration for labor, because it's very similar in terms of the sort of need to go out. Of course, the wage differentials are substantially different. Again, you might ask, why is this happening? Why is the west coast of India? And I'll come to that in a bit. Now, as you turn it, the tip of India, you also see this part of coastal Tamil Nadu, some sort of a breakout here, and then massive part in coastal Orissa, right? So these red regions are basically more than 25%. So what this means is, if you're walking in a village in, say, a district like Ganjam in Odisha, 1 in 4 households has somebody outside for work. Okay, and just to give you a sense of migration numbers in India or anywhere in the world, if you have more than 25% of households in any region reporting out migration, that is mass migration, however you define it. Okay, so these are same magnitudes as, say, Mexico to US in the 1990s, or even for that matter, Britain to America in the late 19th century, what is often known as the age of mass migration. So what the red parts of the map that you see are clearly areas of mass out migration. Okay, and the overall numbers in India we're saying is, in terms of circular migrant workers, we're saying there were over 100 million circular migrant workers in India. That's about a quarter of the workforce. Okay, so these are obviously staggering numbers, so to speak. And then, of course, you have this huge Gangetic belt plain called Eastern Uttar Pradesh. No, not all of Uttar Pradesh, but Eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Then you have the Himalayan economy, that is, Uttarakhand and Himachal. And if you extend it, also Nepal. Nepal is not on this map, but even Nepal is a remittance economy. So all these red shaded regions are remittance economies. And then you have this Rajasthan region out here, which is a relatively newcomer. So it's not an old timer like these other regions that you see on the map. Okay, and then there are these places even in Punjab, like this district here, which is Hoshiarpur, Jalandhar, and all, which have been sending out people, first to Hong Kong, then to Canada, and now to the Gulf, even Italy, in large numbers. And what's interesting, of course, the Northeast is relatively locked out of this map, and much of the Deccan Plateau. Y'all have the Deccan Gymkhana and so on. Much of the Deccan Plateau out here is kind of locked out of these migrations. And so the question to ask is, why does this map look like this? Why is it that some parts of India have more out migration than others? And your first reaction might be, this is just a story of poverty. That is, Bihar is a fairly poor state. And so basically people are moving out of poor places in India, right? And of course, it's true that if you look at per capita incomes, the richer the state, the more the in-migration and the less the out-migration. But there's a twist, right? And so the twist is this, that actually India's richest state today on a variety of indicators happens to be Kerala. And India's poorest state happens to be Bihar, right? And both Kerala in the south and Bihar in the north actually have the same rates of out-migration. And so that's quite remarkable, right? So people from Kerala are going to the Gulf today. Of course, a lot of them went within India in the past. And of course, we know a lot of Biharis now are going to Kerala. In fact, there are more than 2 million North Indians. So literally, there are millions of Keralites in the Gulf, and then there are 2 million North Indians working in Kerala today. Right? So Kerala is a very interesting society where people are working in Dubai, UAE, a variety of places in the Gulf and outside, of course. And then you have 2 million North Indians also working in Kerala. And why are they working in Kerala? Because with migration, there is also upward mobility, because the wage differentials in the Gulf are so high. They've made money, and generations of Keralites have now moved up the value chain, so to speak. They're living in bigger houses. They don't want to do the menial jobs anymore. And so that's opened up a space for employment for jobs which the Keralites would have done earlier, but now they won't because they're too rich, relatively speaking. And so the Biharis who can earn from that are sort of, are taking up those positions. Now, the fundamental connection between Bihar and Kerala is not poverty, right? Because Kerala is much richer than Bihar. It is density. And so that's the starting point. That is, it is really density which ties up all these red spots. Density on arable land, not just on square kilometer, but it's on how much arable land that is. That's why even the Himalayan regions, you think they're very remote, but actually in terms of density on cultivable land, it's quite high. Right? And the Deccan, if you see any map on population density in India, it's fairly sparse. So the pressure to move out basically is much more in these regions, Kerala, and in some parts. You might think even Rajasthan is a desert, but we're talking about density on cultivable land. So cultivable land is much lesser in Rajasthan. So the fundamental driver of out-migration in India for work is actually population density, rural population density of cultivable land, right? And that means that basically there's only that much that agriculture can provide in terms of job opportunities, in terms of livelihoods. And that's what makes people seek greener pastures outside. Again, they send back a lot of money, so that these economies are also remittance economies. If you look at a remittance map of India, it's pretty much the same as what you see here. I've estimated these are literally, in dollar terms, billions of dollars which are flowing to these places out here. If you mark Kerala out as a separate country, it would be the world's most remittance-dependent country in the world. It has remittance to GDP ratio of almost about 30%. Okay. Now, I've also shown you 4 circles out here, and that's in the broadly Deccan region, and they represent another kind of migration in India, and what I call as seasonal migrations. So the red spots on the map that you see belong to the Great Indian Migration Wave. When I say semi-permanent, these are migrations usually, where are these guys working? They're working in the manufacturing clusters of India. They're working in this vast thing called the urban informal economy, which means the security guards on your campus, the cooks in your canteen, the plumbers. It's a good chance that a lot of them come from other districts of Maharashtra or even UP and Bihar, right? Especially security guards. These are the guys who I call as people of the Great Indian Migration Wave. But there are some other guys who we call as seasonal short-term migrants, who are also circular because they're not permanently settling down anywhere and going back to their villages, but their migrations durations are very, very short-term, of a few months. And that is heavily dominated in the construction sector, in the brick kiln sector. And these 4 circles that you see out here have now emerged as important recruiting sites for those migrations. And it is my sort of belief that over time, those migrations will transform into long-term circular migrations, just like from coastal Orissa or Bihar, just as those migrations themselves had started off on a short-term basis, right? So you'll see that there are some districts in Madhya Pradesh which have very little out migration, even though if you look at their material prospects, they are very similar to Bihar. So this brings me to my third point, that is, how do people know about jobs in the cities or outside India and so on? And that is what brings us to this very powerful notion of a social network. Right? So one is the contractor. So these 4 circles, when they go to the cities, often a contractor is getting them. But your security guard who's working on your campus, it's quite likely that the person has not come to the city through a contractor. That person has come to the city through family or caste and community networks. So that is what we broadly call as a social network. So the bulk of job recruitment in the informal sector in India actually does not happen through a contractor, though contractors are a huge part of the construction industry. But if you look at the wider sector, it is mainly network-based phenomenon. And that explains, again, why the Deccan is locked out of India's migration circuits. Because historically, these networks were activated by the British in colonial times for certain needs, like the plantation economy in Fiji, in Mauritius, and Caribbean. Those guys went out from particular sites. So if you remember V.S. Naipaul, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, his ancestors trace their origins to Gorakhpur, which is basically a place in eastern Uttar Pradesh. Right? So they were particular recruiting grounds for the British, and those migrations over time have sustained and built strong social networks. So that when you grow up in those regions, you automatically have a chacha somewhere, someone in your extended family who has moved out. And so that informational network is very, very powerful. I'll just point out also here 2 aspects about caste and gender. That is, much of these migrations, as I said, are linked with caste. But in India, you should know that in these long-term circular migrations, they are overrepresented by the general category. And it's in the short-term seasonal migration, which are overrepresented by the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and so on. So there's a clear 2-pronged migration process in India. And as a result of which, actually, if you look at our cities, there is an overrepresentation of the general category in urban India, because historically, permanent migrations, long-term circular migrations have been overrepresented by upper caste and so on. So for example, we did a field study in the Konkan region, and the first people to leave permanently from the Konkan region were the Brahmins, for example, right? Who went to Bombay, Pune, and a variety of places. So in general, if you look at urbanization rates across communities in India, you'll find that upper castes are much more urban than the lower castes. And that is because upper castes have been pretty much the first to move out of the villages, settle down permanently, or in any case, sort of build these networks. And as I argue in my book, that is why for upward mobility across castes and communities in India, migration is a very powerful means to do that. And a lot of, so a lot of sort of people have argued, and we show in research on, in our Konkan study, about how this can sort of change certain caste relations, how migration, out-migration is so important for that. Now, you might ask the question, why are only the men migrating? Why are the women not migrating for work? And I'll come to women migrating in a bit. They are migrating for work in certain areas, but overall there are two aspects. So, Kerala is fairly gender equal on relative terms in India, but the people going to the Gulf are mostly men. And the reason that happens is because of destination region factors. So there's citizenship. So you cannot get citizenship in the Gulf. So that automatically curtails your migration strategy. And hence the men are going, saving for, working 5-10 years and coming back. But there are also source region factors like gender norms, for example. So in certain places, women are just not expected to move out. And in my book, I trace out some of these norms going back, even to the Arthashastra. Even the Arthashastra had clear norms on, women's mobility, governing women's mobility, and so on. Remember that mobility outside India has always been governed by this notion that if you go outside India, you will lose your caste on return. And this was a notion which has held for several centuries. Even when Gandhi went to study in London, in England, he had to face he had to convince his family that it is fine, and and this is an issue which even now actually props up in certain sort of very orthodox circles. So what I'm trying to say is that even without the passport, which is today the chief regulator of international migration, there have been barriers to migration in India. It's not that people have been able to move anytime, anywhere. It highly depends on your gender. If you're a man, you're much more able to move long distances. It highly depends on your caste. It highly depends on the region. So if you grow up in Azamgarh in eastern Uttar Pradesh, migration is a norm. You see everyone around you migrating. There's peer pressure. You are expected to move when you hit your teenage. Whereas if you grow up in the middle of Madhya Pradesh, you don't have those networks. So you've never seen migration. And so you expect that your lifetime will be spent in the place around. Right? So these are important sort of factors which are important to keep in mind when you understand migration. Okay, now I'll just go through some maps very briefly. This is to compare urbanization and out-migration in India. And you'll see India's issue right now is that a huge part of this hinterland out here, this whole circle comprising of Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bihar, UP, is very little urban, but a lot of it has out-migration. Right? So some sort of a relationship between lack of urbanization and mass out-migration. Now you might think that, of course, the problem out here is that people are moving to cities, but they're moving to cities like Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Hyderabad, and so on. But they're not moving to cities like Lucknow, Patna, Raipur, because historically opportunities were not enough there. So for India to really grow, you can see what's important. It's important for these regions out here to urbanize fairly quickly. Just to give you a sense of how our cities look like. Now this is very old data. It's data from the 1990s, but it's just to make a point. So we say Mumbai is the most cosmopolitan city of India. This is a heat map of Mumbai. It shows you where Mumbai is drawing in migrants from. And again, to show you this point of networks, Madhya Pradesh is much closer to Mumbai. So in economics, you learn something called as gravity models, gravity model of trade, gravity model of migration. And distance is a very powerful predictor of international trade, international migration, and so on. But you'll see out here, you would think many more people from Madhya Pradesh should go to Mumbai, but you see that more people actually go from Eastern UP. And that's the power of networks. That's the power of history. Because certain, the first guy who went in the late 19th century built a contact, built a network, and then more people from that person's village came to Mumbai. And over time, a solid network sort of emerges. Right? And so that is why you have Udupi out here shaded in red, sends out, literally hundreds of thousands of people to Mumbai. You have Tirunelveli, one district in Tamil Nadu, and so on. This is Delhi, which draws in people from the Gangetic heartland. Very different map compared to Mumbai. This is Kolkata, which today, draws in very few people from anywhere in India. More people actually leaving Kolkata than moving in. But Surat, I want to just talk about Surat, because Surat has this one interesting district called Ganjam in Orissa, which sends out literally, hundreds of thousands of migrants to Surat. And this is one of, I've done this train journey with the migrants, part of my fieldwork. It's called the Puri-Okha Express, one of the longest train journeys in India. It takes almost 3 days to go between Puri and Okha. And so this is a question. Why do so many of these guys go out here? And 100 years back, these guys were moving across the Bay of Bengal to Burma. So just like we have Dubai today, Rangoon was the major city about 100 years back. Hence the famous song, Mere Piya Gaye Rangoon, Wahan Se Kiya Hai Telephone. I'm sure some of you have heard of this song. But Burma was in India's consciousness for migration 100 years back, just as how the Gulf is today. But the Burmese, of course, finally kicked out the Indians. They were not very warm to us after the British left. And because of that, they had to change the migration corridor. And so these Odia people started to seek new pastures. In the 1970s, they established contacts in the Paolam industry of Surat. And over time now, much of this powerloom industry of Surat is now powered by these ODM migrants from coastal areas. So a lot of ODM migrants in Gujarat today. So types of migration I've discussed. There are three kinds: temporary, seasonal, which are in a way the most exploitative. So if you think of all the bad things about migration, like today's headlines had child trafficking in it, horrendous kinds of migrations, that's usually classified in this first step. Okay, so this is what we don't want to have, right? Semi-permanent circular is the dominant form of work-related migration in India, right? But as a result, we are not seeing a structural transformation in India like we saw in China, because there's no permanent release of surplus labor from. And permanent is those who can have access to the city, who can afford to buy a house, eventually settle down. Right? And when we were doing this fieldwork in Ratnagiri, there's Marathi saying, "Jechi kholi techi Mumbai." That is, whoever has a house basically can survive Mumbai. And I think that's a very poignant sort of sentence, because housing is a major issue in cities. Those who can save enough to actually invest eventually make the transition to permanently invest. Otherwise, our cities can be fairly hostile, like we saw during the migration crisis. The first thing people will do when there's no problem is back. Now, in terms of reasons for migration, I mentioned work all this time. Of course, a lot of you are yourselves migrants. You're like student migrants, and migration for education in India has picked up tremendously now over the past 2 decades, and so that's a major category of migration. But you'll be surprised to know the biggest migration in India is neither for work or education. It's actually for marriage, right? Because virtually every adult woman in India is classified by the census of the National Sample Survey as a migrant. So there are over 300 million women migrants in India, right? And as I argue in my book, this is a very underexplored sort of migration, because we take it for granted that women, yes, they will move to the sort of husband's family in India. That's the rule in most places. And so is this a kind of, should this even be considered as migration? But it is, because what I've argued in my book is that what we call as Indian diversity in food, in languages, etc., is actually upheld by these millions of migrations, because it's usually the woman who's making the adjustments, that is the adjustments of learning the language. So for example, think of the border states of India on, say, Maharashtra and Gujarat. It is really the women who are migrating across the borders, right? And it is they who actually connect the villages. It is these circles of sort of networks of women across villages which actually sustain India's diversity fabric. So this is a very, very important migration in India that is usually ignored, and it is quantitatively the most important. You might ask, what is the definition of a migrant? Right? The census, NSS have a very simple definition, usually about 6 months or 1 year, which means if you're living outside your place of your usual place of residence for more than 6 months or 1 year, you're considered to be a migrant. Right? Which means if you're a student in Pune right now for a 2-year course, you're a migrant. Okay. Now, if say you were born in Mumbai and you went to Pune and you went back to Mumbai, the census has two kinds of questions. They'll ask you your place of birth. So you'll say Mumbai, I was born in Mumbai, and the census guy finds you in Mumbai. So then you're not a migrant on the basis of place of birth. But the census guy will also ask you what's your place of last residence. And theoretically, you should say Pune because you were staying in Pune for the last 2 years, hypothetically. And then basically the census guy would recognize you as a migrant, and you'll be classified as a return migrant because you've born in Mumbai, your usual place of residence in Mumbai, but then you went for some time to Surat, to Pune, and then you came back to Mumbai. So there are different ways of recording migration, but usually place of residence is more important than place of birth because it captures circular migration. Having said that, the census of India is a serious underestimate on migration. And so we did some work with the Economic Survey of India 2016-17. Have a look at that, chapter 12. In fact, I have a web link on my Google site with a list of resources on migration. So if you want to do anything on migration in India, have a look at that page. It has a list of all the resources. But the government of India now recognizes that there are many more migrants for work in India than what the census enumerates. So there are serious problems in the census enumeration. And we saw that a few months back when every state government wanted to know how many migrants are there in your state. And this is the famous question in April, literally the dialogue from a Sholay. Kitne aadmi the? Every state wanted to, so UP government wanted to know how many of their migrants were in Gujarat, how many of the migrants were in Maharashtra, because they had to make arrangements for trains and buses to get them back. And so we are really short-staffed in terms of data because the census data is not great. And when the census data comes, it comes really late. So the census 2011 data, for example, has still today, 9 years after the census, not been fully released. Right? And the first set of data really came about only last year or so. So there's some serious issues with India's data on migration. The last NSS, which I've done a lot of my work on, is also 2017. So that's also highly. I've talked a bit about this gender, caste, region. I talk a little bit about religion. Are Hindus more likely to migrate than Muslims? Are Jains more likely to migrate? My broad answer would be that it's the region that matters more. It's the region, it's where you are in India rather than who you are, which matters for a variety of things in development. Forget just migration. Right? So, for example, in the Gulf migration, there's no doubt that Muslims are overrepresented in Gulf migration streams. But the bulk of Muslim population in India is concentrated in Western UP, and Western UP actually has a very low rate of out migration for both Muslims and. Okay, so so if you look at the aggregate India story, there's actually not much of a difference. But what you need to see is the regional story, right? And so within certain regions, there is higher or lower propensity and so on. Okay, so region, if out of these 4 core identities in India, gender, caste, religion, region, I would say region really matters the most. That is, where you are matters highly about whether you start thinking of migration decision. And I'm sure this audience looking at this will empathize. If you are born in the Konkan region, it is almost guaranteed that you will go out of the Konkan for some part of your life, and also almost guaranteed that you will aim to return, because that psychology of circular migration is so strong. Right? Whereas if you're born in Mumbai, you will go to maybe other cities, you maybe go outside India, but it's very unlikely that you will retire in a village in India, because you're already now a sort of urbanized resident. Okay. I'm going to quickly wrap up now. So why do people migrate? I mentioned density as a regional factor, but of course wage difference. And this is the classic, Harris-Todaro model, one of the top papers of the 20th century, about how wages sort of equilibrate. But I would say that, even the Harris-Todaro model is not very strictly applicable for India, because for the simple reason there's circular migration. So in the Harris-Todaro model, higher wages pull migrants, and then wages start rising in the rural areas, and so equilibrium is reached. But the problem in India is, of course, that people also go back. So that's another factor. But it's not just economic factors in India that drives migration. Ambedkar famously had said that migration breaks down caste structures in India. So while we say that caste has not disappeared in urban India, but it's a very different form in urban India compared to rural India. Take segregation, for example, residential segregation. There is considerable caste residential segregation in India, especially in Pune, by the way, interesting studies on Pune. But it is nothing compared to what happens in the average village of India, which is pretty much 100% segregation. Right? And so that is why Ambedkar was a big champion of rural to urban migration, saying that it's a very important part of upward mobility. And Ambedkar himself, of course, was a big beneficiary of migration. Again, I mentioned some of these other points. There is also this thing about push factors, right? So farmers' suicides or agrarian distress driving out migration and so on. And so my broad take on this is migration in India is inevitable, rural to urban especially. It must be welcomed. It must be facilitated also. But that does not mean one does not do rural development. But rural development should ideally lead to better quality migration and not the distressed level of migration. Right? So broadly put, just because you invest a lot in certain rural area and you see people moving out, you should not take that as a failure of the development policy. Right? Because people have aspirations. People are anyway going to move out for some reason or the other. Right? But if you see people moving out because of pure starvation or a famine kind of a thing, then that's obviously a big major issue. So there are 2 different ways I think one should look at rural to urban migration. A little note on international migration. I'm just going to say this because a lot of people don't know, especially students of international economics trade. India is a huge recipient of international remittance. Our whole balance of payments, a huge chunk of it, $70 billion to be precise, comes as international remittances. And so where does it come from? It comes from all these big circles: USA, Saudi Arabia, UAE, some of the big countries which have Indians outside, even UK, Bahrain. And where does it go to? A lot of it goes to our cities in the form of NRI deposits, but a lot of it goes directly to households. And so this map on the right out here shows you where it goes. It goes a lot to Punjab from Canada and Italy. Italy now has about 200,000 Punjabis working there. It goes to Kerala. And increasingly in the last 5 years, believe it or not, more people now go to the Gulf as labor migrants from UP and Bihar than Kerala. So that's a big switch that's happened in the last decade. Now I'm going to wrap up by talking about the pandemic and about this whole thing about the COVID-19 and so on. But I'll start again with some historical context. This is a site from 1897. This is a year people in Pune, of course, know because there's a movie now made on the assassination of Walter Rand, who was a plague commissioner in Pune. And there's a big showdown, of course, also between Tilak and Gokhale. It's a very interesting chapter in pandemic history, and I hope you'll acquaint yourselves with it. But this is again an illustration of what happened then. The first sort of response of migrants in India back then, as it was today, is to go back home, right? And why? Because for the sheer reason, because these are circular migrants. Because when there's no work, there's basically no income, and because it's so expensive to live in the city, you want to go back, right? So there's that insecurity. But there's also this idea that the city, for example, is a site of economic security, but the village back home is the site of social security. So when you don't have economic security, you want to go back because you have access to social security. And social security of two kinds: your family, the psychological support that your family gives you back home, but also actually government support. So in today's world, that would mean PDS, ration, etc. Right? So this was a scene from them, and it's what's really fascinating to me is the British had to make the same choice back then, whether to shut down the railways or not. Now the British made a lot of bad choices in pandemic management, and it was a big disaster back then. But on the specific question of trains, they did not shut down the trains. In fact, what they did was to have special trains for migrant workers to take them back home. And in 1896-97, about half of Bombay emptied out. About 400,000 people from Bombay went back home, and they came back later in the year when things had improved. Okay. Now, why did the British actually, keep the railways open? They had a very interesting logic. They said that even if we shut down, it won't matter because people will walk home. Right? So we might as well just keep the railways open and let them go first, and then handle the pandemic. Right? So interesting sort of argumentation out there. Now cut to today, right? And we saw pretty much what the British had anticipated in 1897. That is, if you shut down the railways, people will walk home. Right? Now the act to shut down the railways, of course, was very noble in the sense the idea was to curtail the spread of the pandemic, the spread of the virus. But what I think the policymakers had not realized was the scale of circular migration in India, and the fact that in a time of a health crisis, people just want to be back with their families, just like all of us, right? And so people made very rational choices, in my view, of trying to go back home in the pandemic. And I was arguing this right from day one that special trains should be organized. In the event, special trains were organized, but 2 months later, right? So the Shramik trains were organized. And people did go back home in large numbers. And just like in 1897, people are now coming back to cities because, after all, there's only that much that rural areas can give in terms of employment opportunities. A lot of jobs are based in our cities. So this was a totally avoidable crisis. What it made was that for literally 2 months, we had two crises instead of one. While the whole world had one crisis, that is the COVID crisis, we, in a way, unnecessarily, in my view, created two crises, the migration crisis as well. But what this has done is, of course, put a huge spotlight on what can be done to not have such situations going forward. And so I'm going to end this talk with three important things going forward. So one is, of course, that Indian migrants, because there's such high levels of circularity, there is a serious shortage of social security portability. Which means in India, if you leave your place of birth, you cannot access welfare services. You cannot access PDS ration. You cannot, if you're a woman, you cannot access Anganwadi, based health policies, health welfare schemes. You cannot access a wide range of social security schemes which the government provides, especially state government. And what we've been arguing for over a decade is that we need more portability of social security. And it is based on this government report in 2017, where a lot of us worked on, and a variety of academics have been talking about this. That this whole idea of one nation, one ration card has now come up, which is very promising. But obviously, there are a lot of implementation issues left, and unfortunately, it has been postponed now till next year. I don't know why they postponed it, but I think overall that's a great step. But that's only one part of the overall portability that we should. And so, if you're students of economics, this is a great issue to work on because it's a very live issue. It's a very burning issue, and it's an issue which is going to be at it's going to affect us in the coming 2 or 3 years in terms of implementation challenges and so on. But what we do need in India is a seamless system where you can access social security provided by the state anywhere. irrespective of where you are. I think that's the ideal with which a lot of us have been arguing, and where we should be moving towards. The second thing that this pandemic exposed was also really horrendous housing options for our migrants. We call it slums usually, but the larger question out here is why have we underserved migrants with really low quality, bad, literally bad housing options? And my take on this is that India has focused too much on ownership-based housing, whereas the demand for millions of migrants has always been rental housing. Right? And so we still don't really have a full-fledged rental housing policy framed in India. There's a draft of it, but so I think that's a huge space to be working on. And if your students, it's a lot of knowledge gaps out here. What are the rents? What percentage rent? And how does one develop a vibrant rental housing market in India, which is also affordable for migrants? And the third thing that this pandemic showed was for the class of migrant workers who do come to cities through contractors, what we found in the pandemic was that contractors just disappeared. And so these migrants were literally left in the lurch in the cities. And so that's a huge area which we need to work on. Is if you look at any institution today, people have outsourced it to contractors, and the migrants are dependent on contractors. And nobody really knows who these contractors are, or how does one get accountability from these contractors. And so that's a big, so we talk in the farm bills, for example, the whole spotlight is on middlemen and so on. The same thing with migration for construction work, especially the whole spotlight should be on contractor accountability. All right, I'll end here and be happy to take questions. This is my book on the left, which all of you must read, because if you want to know about migration, I think it covers wide swathes of migration. I've not talked about partition, displacements. The book has part of that. I've not talked about various aspects of development, like brain drain. I'll be happy to take that in the question and answers. I also run 2 social media handles on Twitter and Instagram on business and economic history. And I do run a history internship. So students are interested in business or economic history, encouraged to apply, typically masters or PhD students. And I get applications from across India. It's very competitive. But if you want to, it does not mean you have to become a historian. But if you want to engage more with looking at issues from a long-term time period, a long-term perspective, that's what the internship is aimed at. All right, so I'll stop here. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for a lovely talk. It was every bit as interesting as reading your book was. I'll try and handle the questions as they come up in the chat window. And if there's a lack of questions in the chat window, then I have dozens myself. So we'll see as we go along. The first one is from Sebin. And his question is, how do we know today that what was the rationale that the British used for making sure that the administration did not shut down the railways?
Yeah, I mean, of course, obviously the context has changed, massively, and so on. But I think, I've been thinking of this question a lot. Obviously, I'm not outrightly criticizing the government of shutting down the railways, because obviously these are hard trade-offs to make for anyone, right? But here's what we knew before the lockdown. If you saw how we shut down our airspace, it was much more systematically planned. Right? And I've been following this, from February onwards. We took literally 2 weeks to shut down our airspace. It was very gradual. Right? We did not do that with the railways. So one was on planning. Right? There was no planning. The second issue was in terms of the speech, the lockdown speech. If you saw, it was a very good speech by the Prime Minister in terms of assurances on a variety of things, but it had nothing for migrants, right? And that was a key omission. The first time the government actually started talking about migration was 5 days later. On 29th March, they came out with a circular saying we will waive off rents and so on, which was very difficult to implement in any case. So I think it was a complete blind spot, which was unfortunate, because there were these reports on migration and so on. I think migrants, they should have just been some a particular option for migrants to go back with a quarantine system back home. There are 2 additional reasons from an epidemiological perspective. One is the viruses thrive on density, right? And what we've seen is the migration crisis actually increased density. We got 20,000 refugee camps literally in our country because of the migration crisis, right? More than 500,000 migrants were stuck in different parts. Now, note also, when you shut down the railways like this, there were people on the railway station waiting rooms for 2 weeks, right? So you had all kinds of, there are thousands of railway stations in India. So the idea of decongestion is actually more pragmatic That is, if actually these people leave cities, the cities are also emptier. You'll see the COVID crisis, I think a few cities dominate the overall COVID map, right? So it's clearly a density-driven. All pandemics are density, right? I think there's also a good case. You might say, but the virus would have spread all over India and so on. It's a fair point. Obviously, this is a trade-off that somebody has to make, and the government took a particular trade-off. But I would say, even if you have a policy like what we did, 24th March, shut down the railways, I think the fact that you could see the migration crisis emerging, it was immediate, right? The reaction was almost immediate. I think that response time, the eventual response came 2 months late. And in fact, you might ask that, why did they, if they were going to increase, finally the railways did start 2 months later and special trains were this thing, at a time when actually infection rates were much higher. Right. So in a way, that is also questionable. That is, if you want to shut down the railways, then you better have a plan about shutting down for a long time, because then you know that infection rates are going to go up. And how long are you going to sustain these migrants in 20,000 camps and across the place? So this is a classic case of game theory. Like what you call as backward induction. Where do you see yourself at the end of this game, right? And if you work through it, you will realize that actually it's the best strategy is to let people go. The key part of this whole migration crisis was there was no credible commitment to the time horizon. Right? So first it was 21 days. In the first week, there were rumors that it would be extended, and the government said, no, these are rumors, 21 days only. It's in the April 1st week that this whole thing changed. Right? And state governments said, no, we want it for more and so on. And so then that's how the conversation changed. That's when the real crisis started, because then you don't know how long. Because, okay, you're telling me 1 week I'll live in the city, okay, I'll manage. 2 weeks, now suddenly it's indefinite. And that's when really the whole crisis started. So when you work through this, if you're going to have a strict, there's obviously a lot of learning in this crisis. That is, if you don't know how long it's going to last, it actually makes more sense to just let people go home now, and then then see how it kind of pans out. So I do think that a very strong case to be made for people to have been sent back. No, I'm not defending the British or anything. I mean, the British, they messed up big time on the play, but I'm just using it as an example that it was interestingly a consideration. I'll give you a third example of why shutting down the railways has been a bad idea. And this was in the pneumonic plague of 1911 in China. Same consideration that, we should not let migrants go. They banned second class and third class passenger traffic in China, in Manchuria, Northeast China. And the same response that you saw today in this thing, that is, they were also migrant workers, not allowed to go home, they walked. And it was January, it was winter, and they died walking back home. Right? So we have now 3 examples in history. We have the British, making special trains. We have the Chinese shutting down the railways and people dying, walking back home in the cold. And we have now our own case. And I think 3 cases now, we're just tilting the evidence saying, let's not shut down the railways with the 4-hour notice period. Note, I'm not saying, you should not shut down the railways. I'm saying you give some time, you give some lead time. Right? So you give like a week, let people go, and then shut it down. If you want to shut it down at all. I don't have an issue with shutting down the railway, but I think the manner in which we did was, highly problematic, and then we didn't learn quickly enough from that. So that's my view on it. And I keep saying that there are hard trade-offs, and somebody has to make a decision. So it's not obviously these are obviously open questions. Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. So Ritesh has a question. Many of the relief measures that were announced for migrants expected them to register on the state's website and share their banking details. In your opinion, was this going to make sense given that these seasonal migrants were likely to be uneducated for the most part?
True. I mean, a lot of, okay, there are again 2 classes. I mean, see the average, the guys walking back home, by the way, were not necessarily the poorest or poor of India. They did have bank accounts, right? But, the government of India's responses was, in a way, I agree. When you say, give relief measures, how? The question the government raised, like, how do we know there's no architecture in India to know. The architecture to provide welfare service in India is, in a way, foolproof if you are at your place of birth. Right? Mm-hmm. That is the problem in it. And that is what we mean by portability of social. So now if there are millions of people in Delhi who are, otherwise born in Bihar or UP, it is very tough because you really don't know. There's duplication and, variety. And eventually, I think the kind of blanket free provision that happened, right? So all states eventually say, we'll do whatever it takes. That was a good thing. I mean, that is what you have to do. because then this registration all is too time consuming. It's another layer of, you'll see that's another error we made. Now to go back home, you have to again fill out a lot of forms. There's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of form filling which started happening during the crisis. So in my view, this particular question of should money have been directly transferred to bank accounts, it is a logistical nightmare. If one had, however, one nation, one ration card in place, things would have been much simpler. Food being the major stuff, people would have just got subsidized food wherever, irrespective of where you're born in India. Okay, and similar for health, right? So I think what the crisis tells us is we should be systematically moving towards portable social security. There's another challenge of that, which is basically political economy. So why should there's most states? So why should Maharashtra now start paying for Bihari workers, especially given the whole political reaction to this? So these are big hot potato political questions, which I believe are going to emerge now once the one nation, one ration card scheme is officially launched. And that's why there has to be a center's stopgap arrangement. So center has to step in. But ultimately, I mean, you want to move to a situation where people can move across India. Right? So we don't want to have a situation where people, the Constitution guarantees it. The Constitution of India guarantees free movement of people across states. In fact, the whole argument against, or the whole argument for scrapping Article 370 in Kashmir precisely was this, that, people, why have special provisions and so on. But unfortunately, each state government in India is actually enacting more special provisions. So if you saw what Madhya Pradesh or Andhra Pradesh have done, 80% reservation for locals. Correct. These are completely unconstitutional, domicile-based laws, and people have won cases against these kind of laws. So we want to have a system of seamless mobility of labor, and when people move, they should be able to access any policy anywhere. That is the architecture. Now, obviously, there'll be implementation hassles, but I think that is the broad aim of end goal that we should be moving towards.
Sort of responding to what you said right now, and I'm going to be a little greedy and ask a question that I myself wanted to ask. Would you think that given the North-South divide, both in terms of demographics as well as in terms of economic performance, given the 15th Finance Commission, is it likely that the cultural backlash to an increase in immigration is actually going to go up over time? And A, as an academician, and B, in terms of policy advice, what would you respond to?
I'll take the second one first. There is a big thing that's coming up in 2026.
Yes.
And that is this. So this is this, the Lok Sabha seats redrawing thing, right? And that population right now is set on 1971 basis, right? So our Lok Sabha's, whatever 540 odd seats are based on that 1971 population. I think they better stick to that 1971 population, right? Because if they are going to move into the 2011 population, South India loses substantial number of seats in that process. For actually, it's like a penalize. It's rewarding the northern states for bad performance. Bad performance means higher fertility, relative terms, and higher population to down there. So that's the first point. That is, in terms of policy, let's stick to the 1971 population forever, in my view. Because literally that is penalizing good performance. That is how one should really see that. So that's the big question of the decade in front of us, and I think this will become. If people are going to say that we want to have even more northern focus, so that's one sticking issue. Kerala has actually been a beneficiary of fiscal federalism in India because of its migration position. Not many people know this. It's because of its remittance economy. So the way it works is, income taxes go to the center, but sales, all these local taxes usually the government gets, right? Like land, stamp duty, these are local government taxes. So because, literally a fifth of the workforce in the Gulf, they are paying income tax or not paying income tax, anyway, it doesn't matter for Kerala state government, it goes to the center. But they send back money and that's spent. And so that boosts Kerala state government profits. And the Kerala government knows this. So Kerala, out of the 4 southern states or 5, Kerala benefits hugely from its international remittance economy, because it gets a lot in terms of state revenues, but it does not give proportionate amount for its workforce. It's actually going to the Gulf government, or it's going. So actually, at least one South Indian government benefits from its particular migration structure. But your specific question of whether it is a potential time bomb in terms of political, let's put it, will there be more anti-migrant political rhetoric in the South, I think yes, absolutely. It's the migration is going to continue. South needs the labor, just like Europe needs the labor. South is aging much faster than the North, so the migration is going to happen. It's already happening, like I mentioned. 2 million North Indians in Kerala. You're already seeing cultural changes. You're seeing, there's a Malayali film with Bengali songs. So
Yes.
one song which is sung in Bengali, reflecting Bengali laborers on the field. I've been on plantations in South India where Bihari workers are speaking fluent Tamil, for example. So the earlier linguistic divide, earlier people are not going from north to south because of the linguistic divide. Today the wage differential is high enough to compensate for that. Right? So people are going down because they don't mind learning the language or getting by, but the wage differential is very high. And the reaction is going to come. I think the reaction will be very stark in Tamil Nadu. Because of this age-old Hindi issues. And so it'll be very interesting to see how political parties deal with it. But hopefully, and so as an academic, I think my responsibility is to point out that, look, let's not get very anti-migrant about this. And the way you do that, I think, is to point out that you don't want to impose Hindi because that is the fear in the South. Right? So if you're going to say on the one hand, let's allow these migrations, but not take into account the fears of the South, I think that's also not being very academically honest. So on the one hand, I'll say, let these North Indians go to the South, but at the same time, you can't impose, your language, so to speak, on the South when they don't want to. So it's going to be a very delicate bargaining process, I think, and a lot matters on who's in the center. I think which political party in the center and who's in the state. I think that sort of an interesting dynamic might emerge eventually.
Excellent. We are beyond. I want to be respectful of your time, but if you have the time, maybe 3-4 more questions. Is that okay?
I have a lot of time, so yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. So Sunita has a question. Do you find any correlation between gender-neutral migration policies and declining female ratio among in and out migrants? What are the ways forward to make migration policies more gendered to encourage migration ratio amongst women?
It's a great question. I mean, how do you make? Let me give you the context first. So I mentioned destination region policies. So you could have hostile cities or Gulf citizenship laws that automatically structure gendered migrations. But they could be source region norms. And when I was doing my field work in Surat during my PhD, so I was on a factory setting, and it's very interesting. So same tasks, but there's a family, husband and wife, who had come from Khandesh, northern Maharashtra, and Adivasi family. And there's a Bihari, the stereotypical single male migrant worker from Bihar. And both of them doing similar tasks, the same setting. And this was a fascinating question for me. Why is this family from Khandesh with the family, that is man and woman, whereas this fellow? And so I asked them, so what in your case, why have you brought your wife, and in your case, why have you not brought your wife? And it very starkly reveals the gender norms. Right? And so this guy from Khandesh said, I cannot imagine moving without my wife or my child for that matter. And he laughed and said, I can't imagine how this guy, leaves his family back home. Right? And that fellow said, I can't imagine getting my wife to the city because what will others think back home? Because there are suspicions on the woman, right? There's suspicion because the Bihari guy's work is also living in a sort of a male ghetto. Right? So if the woman is coming to the city, there are questions raised on safety. There are questions raised of all sorts of things, right? Of rumors of who's the lady with, etc. So from that perspective, these are the perspectives governing women's mobility. Right? So there is a lot of source region norm basis attached to it. So the more I've thought about it, I've realized it's very, in terms of policy initiatives, there's very little. Because these are very long entrenched stereotypes. So now you can say over the long run with better female education, I think the real route will be where women go as students, which is happening. Female migration rates in India are picking up substantially for education. And then women delay the age of marriage, enter the labor market at that age of 20 to 25. And really that's when this single female migration really happens. But it's interesting that, I mentioned this Adivasi connection. It is really in India's tribal heartlands, which most sociologists argue are relatively more, female autonomy in India. It is precisely from those regions that you're seeing a lot of single woman migrations. Right? So it's from Chhattisgarh, for example, a lot of districts in Chhattisgarh which are sending out single women migrants, like Bihar has historically been sending single male migrants. Right? So a lot of this, I think, my short answer is there's very little policy can be. I think the larger policy has to be making our cities more conducive for women to live in. Right? I mean, that's a very big sort of policy architecture. But a small step towards that would be women dormitories, for example. So women don't have enough places to live in cities as single women. Right? And China did this in a great way. China built these massive dormitories for migrants, for both men and women. But today, that's a major point. So if you look at the particular class of workers, for example, working in the fashion or the mall industry, right? These are women workers, often single women. Where are they staying? And a particular student of mine who did a study on this in Bangalore found that a huge concern for them is housing, because it's very tough to get decent housing for this particular category of workers. So as a policy thing, make our cities more welcoming to women migrants. And how do you do that? One lever we have is housing. So if you have decent housing options, that's another thing. But I think the really large question is female workforce participation in our cities. It's very low in India. It's about 10 to 15%. And how do we get that to 60% like it's in China? So that's the real elephant in the room. Once that starts shifting up, automatically it's like a network effect. Automatically more women will be attracted towards us. So there are no short. I'm afraid there are no quick policy. In my view, at least, there are no quick sort of policy bullets on this particular thing. But I completely agree with you that it should happen. That is, we need more gender balanced migrations in India. I think that I'm very clear.
Okay. Two different questions into one mega question, as it were. So Saeed had a question about whether there is a correlation between decentralization and migration. There was another question about, and it's a slightly unfair one, but I'll club it over here. How would you have managed the crisis in the pandemic? What path would you have chosen if you were the Prime Minister? And feel free to skip the question because I can't begin to imagine how you would answer it. But largely speaking, and I want to connect also over here another question that was asked about the fact that data was not collected, or so the government said in the Lok Sabha, about deaths of migrant workers. So how much of the work on migration should be done at the state level? How much should be done at the central level? What level of decentralization is optimal when you want to think about migration issues is the broad question.
Yeah, I mean, all excellent points. This point about centralization is very important. I've been arguing for the last few months that now, of course, the GST thing is under stress right now. Yeah. But what is the GST Council? It is a council to deliberate on goods and services taxes. But essentially, that is a lot about the movement of goods and services across states in India. And we don't have something similar for labor. We don't have a state council, interstate council on labor. And I think one of the things that this crisis has shown is maybe we need to have some sort of a council, which might also be useful when stuff like One Nation, One Ration card comes out as a mechanism to resolve disputes for that. So one of the things I've been arguing is that we need an equivalent of a GST council for interstate sort of movement of labor. Now, but the initiative has to come from the center. Right? So while we say migration could be a state-to-state movement, there is some policy. There's an MOU between between Odisha and the southern state of India on welfare of migrant workers and so on. So such MOUs, there's a model of MOUs between states, but I think the real push has to come from the center. So the One Nation, One Ration is probably the example through which it should happen. On the question of what if I was the PM and all, I mean obviously the PM has 20 years of administrative experience and much more qualified than me. So whatever I say is very limited. But I think it would have helped to take an advice on migration, as simple as that. Right? So maybe there was not much feedback given on migration, and I found it a bit surprising because there was a real lag of about 5 days. For 5 days, in fact, if you saw what happened, the first pressure to move back was in Delhi, and there's this whole social media misinformation that there are rumors being sent and so on. And yes, there were a few rumors and so on, but a lot of what we saw in India was there was a genuine pressure. And so I thought the government is very late to respond. So I don't have too much. I mean, you either shut down or not. That's a policy decision. Somebody has made it. We respect the decision. But I think the response time in quickly sort of adapting to seeing the situation on the ground, I think that was a bit slow. And maybe one needs to pay more attention on that. What I would like to see, of course, is like the British, having a full-fledged report on the pandemic management measures. The British did a lot of bad things, but the British, after every episode, had a commission which would document everything, right? Good or bad, believe it or not. If you look at the famine commission reports of India, if you look at all of that, it's a treasure trove for us, the economic historians, to look at them today, because you get a sense of even the critiques against the government. The Labour Commission report, you have voices of everyone even bashing the British out there. Right? So the British has a very strange style of administration. And believe it or not, it is precisely those reports which over time cut down famines in India. It is precisely those, report after the Plague Commission report, which came out in 1898. It had bad science because the prevailing science out there of that time was, plague is transmitted by miasma and, bad sanitation, when it was actually rats and rat fleas. That science came about 7 years later. So if you see the report today on its own, a lot of it is junk. But every year they came out with additional reports. And over time, even the scientists looked at those reports, got more evidence, and tested their theories against those reports. So I think it's a good practice to systematically document all that we've done. For example, a great thing the Kerala state government did. So we're stuck. We find ourselves in a similar situation, a few years down the line. The Kerala government, fantastic thing they did with the migrant workers. These camps which magically appeared because migrants were trying to go back. They were stopped at the borders, and so you got a new camp. They basically did three things. They gave them free mobile charging points, right? Because mobile is the most important gadget for any person today, especially migrant workers who want to be in touch with. So they gave them mobile charging points. They gave them a carom board, right? So it's something really small and tiny, but a carom board in India for people, because what do you do when there's nothing? Then you have to have some engagement. And then they started giving some food of their source region, right? So they started serving them Bihari dishes in Kerala, just to give a sense that you're not too far away from. So three things: native food, mobile phone charging, so that you have a mobile phone access, and a carom board. I think this is precisely the stuff that needs to be catalogued, so that this memory does not. I think memory is very important. If you see how public health has improved in Europe, even they had the plague, they had the Black Death. Some 1/3 to half the population went up, but over time they have developed through this systematic documentation a particular culture of sort of relying on so there's cumulative knowledge, and I think that's what we should do. So at the end of this year or something, we should press forward to like a report, but I doubt it'll come. We should have added a report on demonetization. I don't think it's happening. So whether you like it or not, I think the learning from the British there is to systematically document an experience with a particular episode and put it down for posterity. So that people can draw upon some information from it. I think that's a great sort of culture to have.
Great. One last question and one request, and we'll wrap up with that. Simran has a question about the linkage between inequality and immigration, or more generally migration, both from a domestic as well as an international perspective. So one, what does the research say? And second, what is your own intuition about the linkages between inequality and migration, particularly within India?
So the first part is the international migration is most well studied. Simply put, international migration from India is contributing to more inequality in India. For the simple reason, if you saw that international migration map, where are they going from? They're going from Kerala, which is already a rich state. They're going from Punjab, which is already a reasonably rich state. They're going from Goa. They are now going from UP, Bihar, but it's still small. Right? So all these years, those $70 billion, right? Where does that money go? And I've done a lot of work on the remittances.
Sir, I can have one question.
Sure, I'll just finish this point.
Can I have one question? Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. I just finished this one point. Yeah. So that money, the $70 billion, half of it goes into our cities, actually NRI deposits, but half of them, just think of it, $35 billion goes to Kerala. So Kerala's disposable income, not GDP, but disposable income, which is GDP plus remittances, so to speak, is substantially higher, and they have that much more money to sort of work. Within Kerala, believe it or not, so who's going to the Gulf from Kerala? It is the better off, because you can't just go to the Gulf. You need to pay about 1 lakh to the recruitment guy to get the visa. There's a whole transaction cost to go to the Gulf. So the poorest of the poor in Kerala cannot go to the Gulf. You need to have a certain amount of economic capital. Even in India, by the way, internal migration, to be able to survive in a city for a long time. Right? So migration does have transaction costs, and that is why those who can migrate get the success of migration and then remit back. International migration broadly contributes to more regional inequality in India, and within those regions, more class-based inequality. You might be surprised to know Kerala, which has been under sort of a communist state, at least the Communist Party for such a long time, is one of the most unequal states of India in terms of consumption Gini. Right? So you look at consumption Gini coefficients, and Kerala is. If you look at the National Sample Survey data, it is always almost ranked at the top. And that is a huge part is because of remittances. The remittances going off to the already better off. And so, they're contributing. I do have a paper in the Indian Journal of Labor Economics on remittances in India. And I do make a note on domestic thing out there, but it's not too analytical. But I think a similar case exists there. The guys who are sending back money within India are also relatively more sort of well off than the guys who cannot send this money. Right? So the security guards on your campus who are sending back money, believe it or not, they are not the poorest of poor from the villages they're coming from. Right? They're from the middle to upper even strata of the villages they're coming from. So while it's great that the security guard on your campus, is earning money in the city, got a reasonably secure income, sending back money, but it does contribute to inequality back home in the sense that this is a class which is already better off in the village. Right? So does that mean that we should ignore migration? My sense is no. This is again this logic of rising boats. As long as everyone is getting some, as long as the pie is size of the pie is growing, some amount of inequality is fine. And we actually documented this for this village in the Konkan region, which we analyzed. B meaning literally Kalyani, who's a PhD student at this. She did a census of this village. And we linked it up with old census reports. So we got this nice 60-year kind of a study of this one village. And nothing has changed in terms of land holding in that village. So the same early inequality between the Marathas and the Mahars in that village, nothing has changed. But because of migration, the sheer sort of status of the Mahars in that village has changed. This is, nobody can, now that we have the connection with Bombay, and they were later to start the migration with Bombay, the Marathas left first. But now that they established the connection in Bombay, they say that we've got a new sense of dignity. So inequality is not just also economic. So in this particular case, what we found was that while not much had changed in terms of land ownership and so on, same levels of inequality, very little land ownership among the Mahars in that village. But yet they would themselves say that migration has completely transformed their lives. So that is, I think, there are also non-economic aspects which need to be captured when we talk about inequality and migration. So on the whole, if you read my book, there's also a question on pros and cons of migration. One of the reasons I wrote the book was to highlight also how important migration can be for upward mobility. Obviously, now there are thousands of cases where it does not happen. It's not that everyone becomes an Amitabh Bachchan, go to Bombay and become Amitabh Bachchan. But a lot of people can become not Amitabh Bachchan, but somewhere in between. And of course, there are people who literally go down the ladder also. And so those stories also need to be documented. But if you read my book, on balance, I take a positive picture. And I gave this NET exam many years back, many years back, and I also failed it. So if any of you have failed NET exam, full sympathy with you. And I believe that one of the reasons I failed it because of the first question was precisely this. The first question of my NET exam economics was state the problems associated with rural to urban migration. So not critically examine it, not like this nice question on the chat window, state the pros and cons. It just said state the problems associated with rural to urban migration. Right? And I wrote this long answer saying it's not a problem. So I don't know, maybe that was the reason I failed it. But this is the kind of this is also an important thing because in India we've had a tradition of development policy which says that if we do rural development, there will be no need for people to migrate. And it's been so ingrained that what a lot of us who work on migration says that's absurd because all the evidence within India suggests that the first thing you do when you become rich in a rural area is leave. Right? So you're not leaving out of distress, but you're leaving because of aspirations. Because you want your children. So if you look at the rich landowners in coastal Andhra or Punjab, their kids are in the nearest towns or abroad. In the case of coastal Andhra, US, in the case of Punjab, Canada. Right? So these aspirations change over time. And so it's absurd to think that rural prosperity can actually curtail this broader flow of migration. So I think that's broadly my thinking on that.
It's the best reason I've heard yet for giving the net exam. Sometimes you can get a fantastic book out of it. So the
Yes.
request
Can I have one question to
yes,
Tumbe?
please.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Nearly 4 lakhs of laborers from different parts of the country will come to Ganjam district. After that, the COVID cases in the enhanced. The government at that time assured to the laborers to provide the
Mr. Sahu, I'm sorry, but
Okay, maybe write down on the chat window.
So
Breaking
can
you a
you-
bit.
better if you write it down.
If you could
But
write
answer,
in
that is
chat
a
window.
question answer. So what should be your my point is to Tumbe sir, is there any policy failure of the government, or what should be the policy strategy to protect the particular labor migration from Ganjam district to particularly Surat city? One is second, in the earlier time, though it is a century old migration, but in the last now the pandemic is on coronavirus. So my point is, what should be the health protection of the laborers to be ensured? Now recently, two states have signed one MU, but there is no such type of concrete evidence from the two sides regarding the health safety and sustainability of migrant laborers. So please,
Yeah, excellent.
okay,
Two excellent
thank
points.
you, sir.
Two excellent points. I think the second one is simpler.
Okay.
I have been consistently arguing that we need to get our migrants back into our cities, and for that, it is the state's responsibility to step in and provide the health guarantee, not the employers. I think that is what I've been arguing. That is, the employers of India have anyway too many bureaucratic hassles to face, and at this juncture, when it's really. I'm more of the view that the state should intervene directly to provide welfare measures rather than employers to do that. So in this particular case, health certification, ensuring health of workers, etc., should be the state governments. And you're right that you can have sort of an MOE model to do that. You're also right that unfortunately that's not happening. But I think this is what I've been arguing. I've been writing on this topic for many months now. But your first point on what should happen in Ganjam and so on. But this larger question on when will these migrations stop? People have been moving from Bihar now 100 years. When will it stop? There's one answer to that. It is now stopping in Kerala, right? And it will stop everywhere when fertility rates go down. Right? So when that pressure on land eventually falls. So there's a natural process. There's a demographic transition process. Right? And so Kerala is aging now. Fewer kids are born, and so the pressure on land is falling. And that's when the out-migration pressure is eventually. Unfortunately for Bihar, it's going to take many decades to get there. So in our lifetimes, it's not happening. Whatever development you do in Bihar, I can assure you, 40 years down the line, you will still see the same map, what I showed you, that is Bihar showing out migration. Ganjam is somewhere in between. Maybe Ganjam might change. But let me just point out the special case of Ganjam. Ganjam is situated in the region of Odisha, which has faced a super cyclone, forget cyclone, a super cyclone, roughly about every 10 to 15 years, consistently for 130 years. In fact, in a footnote in my book, if I'm not mistaken, I mentioned all the years it had the super cyclone. So migration is a very stable strategy given this larger context that whatever you do and invest in your source region, everything gets undone every 10 or 15 years because of the super cyclone. So a lot of times, people think that migration is very risky, etc. But people are making choices between a lot of other risky factors. Right? So floods in Bihar. Right? So a lot of times you ask people from Bihar, why do you migrate? You have land back home. They'll say, what's the use of having land when every year there's floods? And similar case when I have talked to people in Ganjam saying that nobody wants to go to Surat, but we know that this is safer than being here or putting all our eggs in this basket. Because every 10 or 15 years there's a super cycle. So there are these strange sort of larger than life elements which affect some regions of India. In the case of Ganjam, very clear super cycle. So I think for Ganjam, what should really happen is that these migrants who are going should learn from their Gujarati counterparts who work in the diamond industry, different economics of industries. But the Gujarati migrants they have started their own clusters. The people who go to Surat from Bhavnagar, Amreli, they have so they are also poor migrants, but over 5 or 10 years, they become owners of those companies. So the question to be asked is, why aren't the workers, even one worker, I'm sure there must be some examples, but why can't the Ganjami workers start their own powerloom firms in either Odisha or in Gujarat itself? Right? And I think that moving up the value chain should be the end goal of any migration policy. So I don't want to see, so if people are still moving out from Ganjam 20 years down the line, which is pretty much what the case is going to be, that won't be a surprise. But I will be disappointed if people are moving for the same kind of jobs. Every generation, you should be moving up for a higher kind of jobs, which is happening in Udupi, for example, or Konkan. So people from Udupi, Konkan are not moving out for the same, on average, they're moving on for much higher wage jobs than Udupi being classic example. Even today, Udupi is a completely remittance-based economy like Ganjam, but Udupi is the second richest district of Karnataka after Bangalore. Right? And so it's one of the richest districts of India, so to speak. If you look at the Karnataka's Human Development Index, it ranks second after Bangalore. And it's a completely remittance-based economy. So you have two districts, two examples, both mass out migration, but one where over time people have come up and used those migrations to get into new occupations and higher wage thing, whereas here you're moving into dead-end jobs with little upward mobility. And so the key of any migration strategy should ideally be to come up over time. So that's how I look at it. But I won't be too surprised, unfortunately, for anyone who's gone to Ganjam. In fact, many of these places which have high out migration, these are stunningly beautiful places, right? So if you look at the Konkan region, if you go to the Konkan, I had gone there with my students, many of the students from Bihar, and they said, sir, why would anyone leave this place? This has everything. If you go to Ganjam, it's beautiful, and you have the Chilka Lake, which is not too far away. And as I mentioned in my book, there are two kinds of migration. There's the bird migration to Chilka Lake and from there. And then there's the Puri Okha Express every year, which take these migrants outside. But the fact is that even in these beautiful places, people, there is a pressure to go out. Kerala, God's own country, a fifth of the workforce is outside. So unfortunately, these migrations happen for a particular logic. But over time, they will fall eventually.
My grandfather is from Konkan, and he used to say, he passed away 20 years ago, but he used to say that the village feeds your soul, but the city feeds your stomach. It's always clear to me.
I think, summarizes the entire thing in the next sentence. Yeah.
So one request before we wrap up, and hopefully you'll agree, I think more people in India need to know about Dwijendra Tripathi. So if you could invite him back for a session on who he was and how his legacy could be carried forward. Hopefully you'll say yes, and I'll make sure to follow up and make sure that the session happens. But if you can call you back for the webinar.
I would love to, because we also had a conference in his name, and we had I also interviewed him for the archives project, so I happen to know a lot about his life. Yeah, but it's something of business history or economic history there also.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Hello, Ashish, sir.
Yes, Bhupesh, please.
Yeah. So can I take a vote of thanks?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. First of all, I'm very thankful to Chinmay Tumbe, sir, for accepting our invitation. And despite from his busy schedule, he has given us a time for the webinar. And also the webinar was very successfully has been carried out by him. And he has given a essential point on the issue of migration. Since sir is working over the 10 years, and very many things has been discussed. The economical jargons has been fitted into the ongoing incidents which has happened and already also happening in the case of migration. That was really amazing for me as well, because I'm also working, sir, in the international migration. I carried out study for Ratnagiri, so some villages of Ratnagiri. I'm about to submit. So it was really a great pleasure to me to hear you for the webinar. I'm also thankful to the participant. There is a number of register has been happened, but due to some technical reason, we are not able to accommodate everyone. But I make sure that the recordings for the today's webinar will get shared to each and every participant, so that it will be it will be good for them also. Those are working for the issue of the migration and so on. Lastly, I also thankful to my director, because of some job. Sir is busy with some work, so he is not able to join for today's webinar. but he also helped us and he encouraged for the conducting this kind of webinar. And also thankful to Ashish Kulkarni sir, my friend and faculty member Pranav Raj, and also there are two more members like Varun Miglani and uh, Tarun Kandewar, who has also supported me for carrying out this webinar. So I lastly conclude that the session is over, and the feedback link definitely will be shared after the session get over.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks. And I have shared on the chat window my migration resource page. Just email it to everyone who's registered.
Yes, sir. Yes, definitely, sir. And thank you so much, sir, once again for accepting our invitation.
Yeah.